Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you want to hear more episodes, please become a patron of the show for just $2 a month. Go to the website and click the Patron button, foreigncountries.podbean.com. Anglo-Scandinavian England saw the development and spread of the burhs, fortified towns set within a trading and agricultural landscape. In this episode, I'll be looking at two studies that provide the context for the growth of those burhs, but from two quite different directions. Later on, I'll be talking to Professor Helena Hamerow about the Feedsax project and Late Mersey and Stafford. But first, I'm joined by Victoria Ziegler of the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. Victoria's paper, From Wick to Burh, was recently published in the Archaeological Journal, and it sought to better understand the population shift from the early Saxon Lundenwic into the old Roman town of Londinium during the 9th century. So welcome, Victoria. Being a Londoner yourself, I imagine the story of London has a certain significance for you.
Really, the background came during one of my walks back home through central London, as we've been discussing late Saxon settlement types, that the focus of Anglo-Saxon occupation in London had actually shifted sometime during the 9th century. The population moved east, away from Lundenwic, a thriving mercantile settlement somewhere near Covent Garden, towards a different area, which was then known as Londonburh, behind the ancient Roman walls of Londinium. The archaeological evidence seems to suggest that Lundenwic itself was completely abandoned. So why on earth did a settlement move 1.5 kilometres down the road? The route down Fleet Street was then the main thoroughfare between the wharves in the east and St Paul's in the west. And that's within the space of a generation or two. So what I did was reconsider and apply new methods to the interpretation and timing of that move, because it's undoubtedly quite a defining period in London's history, one that's not much spoken about. And I wasn't too far behind archaeologists and historians for much of the 20th century, because they'd long assumed that early medieval London had always been located within the bounds of its Roman predecessor.
And what was the known background to the archaeology of Saxon London?
In 1984, two archaeologists, Martin Biddle and Alan Vince, separately identified the site of Lundenwic as being near Aldwych and the Strand. In fact, the name Aldwych kind of gives it away, which means Old Wick. Then after that, excavations proliferated in the area. And so this hypothesis was confirmed. And the story of Londonwic was believed to be broadly understood. By the late 7th century, it was a major trading centre. It had a beach market and wharves. The early to the mid-8th century were its heyday. The Venerable Bede described it as an emporium for many nations who come to it by land and sea. But not long after that, it seems to have entered a period of decline and economic stagnation. By or before the mid-9th century, occupation had ceased in Lundenwic, and it had been replaced by smaller dispersed settlements along the north side of the Thames. So by the mid-9th century, there is no substantial archaeological evidence of Saxon activity anywhere in the Lundenwic area. On the other hand, there's very little evidence of Saxon activity within the Roman walled city before the mid-9th century. And it seems likely that this area was more or less abandoned until the abandonment of Lundenwic. Asser and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle both herald King Alfred's defeat of an occupying Viking force in around 886 and the subsequent reoccupation of London. And he's supposed to thereafter have promoted its planned and structured rejuvenation as one of his fortified burh sites. There's archaeological evidence in the Londonburh area at about 25 sites showing that Anglo-Saxon occupation began again in the mid-9th century and accelerated after 950. By the end of the 10th century, London was once again becoming a major commercial and political centre. So the narrative about London in the 9th century seemed fairly settled. There was a few hundred years of trading in the Wick, shifted all down to the Burh, down the road, and then things carried on much as they were behind the walls. And the place name evidence bears this out. When there are references to London between about 600 and 800, they're usually with the suffix wic or vicus or portu. This identifies locations of a specific purpose or function, which is often economic. But after 850, the wic suffix falls out of use, and we start to hear London referred to as burh or birrig or burg, and that denotes a stronghold. And the first reference to Londonburg, interestingly, is in 851 in the context of a Viking attack. And what became clear as I started researching it is that the historical and archaeological interpretations of the relationship between Lundenwic and Londonburh were pretty well established, and their separate chronologies were agreed, but they were dealt with as two completely separate entities. And the period of the shift itself was treated like a lacuna. They were in one place and then they were another, but not much research had happened into that shift. So I decided to really focus on that to see if we could determine what was going on, what people were doing on the ground. Perhaps you can come up with some reasons for why they were doing these things.
So why is it important to address this lacuna now?
Purely because we now have far more data than ever before. Discussions of Lundenwic and Londonburh have become formulaic. They existed without reference to each other, and each settlement was interpreted according to separate pre-existing narratives. Lundenwic is a mercantile settlement. You talk about proto-economic market economy systems. Londonburh, you talk about town planning, you talk about defence. And the question of the move between the two settlements had fallen into that lacuna, a slightly obscure period with superficially unsatisfactory archaeology that's most easily explained by cursory reference to Viking incursions, diminishing trade and economic stagnation. And that's regardless of whether the archaeology itself supports such broad brush interpretations. But the shift is clearly of historical, social and political significance, and London soon went on to become the preeminent settlement in the land. Did the move between Lundenwic and Londonburh trigger this? Or was the status of later London caused by unrelated political, military or economic factors?
Okay, so what were those new analytical methods that you applied?
So I came up with a relatively simple hypothesis, and that was that similarities in the assemblages found in the two settlements might indicate connections between them, and differences would indicate a more distant relationship. So I constructed a set of premises. First of all, archaeological evidence indicates that in the 9th century, the focus of Anglo-Saxon occupation shifted from one place to another. We have well-stratified archaeological assemblages, and they can be used to create quantifiable and categorized data sets relating to structures, crafts, industries, ceramics, and small finds. And those data sets enable the identification of distinct occupation types, which you can map spatially and temporally. And finally, those types, once you've mapped them and collated them, can be compared to identify parallels and contrasts between the two settlements. And those can be used to explore questions of continuity or change. I reviewed all the published and publicly available sites that have been excavated until 2007 in the case of Lundenwic, 2010 in the case of Londonburh, summarized all the information that I could find about those. And then after that, I put them into Excel format, because by consistently classifying the evidence, I'll be able to conduct multivariate statistical analysis.
Right, what do you mean by that? Multivariate statistical analysis?
In this case, correspondence analysis. Correspondence analysis generates scatter plots that present patterns of variation in the data in two-dimensional format. 2 points close together on one of the scatter plots are similar in some way, and 2 points plotted far apart are different from each other. Correspondence analysis also produces diagnostic statistics that accompany each plot, and those are used to identify the variables with the most and the least impact on the distributions. So what I hoped is that by gathering enough evidence together in the correct format, correspondence analysis would highlight statistical patterns arising out of the variations in the archaeological assemblages in the two settlements. The greater the variation between the assemblages would, statistically speaking, show the more distant the relationship, and conversely, a lack of variation would indicate a closer statistical relationship between the two. What I decided to do was combine statistical analysis with a standard review of case studies and see what that threw up.
Okay, talk me through the evidence. What did you find?
Of course. So in total, 31 archaeological sites provided positive, diagnostically dated evidence of activity post-dating 770 in Lundenwic. 770 is a cut-off date because that's when you start to see specific ceramics fabrics, which are the main diagnostic evidence in this period. Fabrics in Londonburh, when found alone, late Saxon Shelley, diagnostically date sites there to before 950, and 25 sites in Londonburh were before 950. From these, 26 Wick sites and 16 Burh sites produced evidence good enough for my correspondence analysis. And the results were pretty interesting, and they confirmed the clear distinctions in the archaeology of Lundenwic and Londonburh. They also revealed new and diverging patterns of consumption and production in the two settlements, and these reinforced the chronological and sociocultural distinctions between Lundenwic and Londonburh. All the evidence was consistent with there having been no overlap in the occupation of the two settlements, which suggests that while King Alfred had great biographers and a good PR machine, he really didn't promote any kind of elite mandated shift from one to the other in response to a specific Viking threat. So when I ran correspondence analysis on all sites and all available categories of evidence, the Lundenwic sites were clustered close together around the axial point, and the Londonburh sites were plotted on the right side, and that shows much variation amongst those burh sites themselves as between the burh site group and the Wick cluster.
And you looked at different categories of evidence.
To explore patterns of variation among these tightly defined groups, as you said, I broke it down into different categories of evidence. So when structural features alone were compared, the apparent distinction between Wick and burh site was completely manifest. The occupants of Lundenwic had a clear preference for surface laid structures, and in Londonburh, they built sunken floored buildings, although examples of each type were found in both settlements, which indicates that they were familiar with both techniques, but making specific construction decisions. Timber wall forms were more frequently found in Londonwic, and daub was more frequently found in Londonburh. And while daub is not necessarily just used in buildings, it seems likely from the sheer quantity in Londonwic that there were more wattle and daub surface laid structures, and in Londonburh, it was these sunken floor structures with plank cladding. There may be some evidentiary and survival biases coming into play. What's interesting, though, is that we have a lot more buildings found in Londonwic, despite this survival bias, than there are in Londonburh. So if sunken floor buildings had been common in Londonwic, and they are more likely to survive because they're cut features rather than surface laid, then we would have found them. So overall, the direct comparison and quantification of the evidence for late phase structures in Londonwic and early phase structures in Londonburh confirmed the use of the different construction techniques in the two settlements.
So that's buildings. What's the second category?
Ceramics followed a similar pattern. There's marked differences in the pottery assemblages that allow overt distinctions to be made between the two settlements. As there's very little overlap in the fabrics found in both places, ceramics chronologies, as I mentioned, have been used to date and distinguish between the different phases of occupation in Londonwic and Londonburh. The occupants of Londonwic between 770 and 850 very specifically used handmade Ipswich wares and shell-tempered wares, which reflect trade links with East Anglia and Kent. Continental fabrics included finer Badolf-type wares, and there's a lot of continental fabrics in Londonwic. Pre-950 sites in Londonburh, on the other hand, primarily produced wheel-thrown late Saxon Shelley from the Chilterns, Thetford wares from sources within the Danelaw, and imported Rhenish red-painted and grey wares, although continental fabrics like these are found at significantly fewer burh than Wick sites. So in the burh, 5 out of 25 sites produced continental wares, and in Londonwic, 16 out of 31 sites. So not only are the pottery assemblages themselves quite distinct, but the different production sources also suggest that trade networks represent different geographic and cultural affiliations in the two settlements. So overall, as with the structural evidence, the different pottery fabrics highlight very specific chronological and cultural discontinuities between occupation in the two settlements.
Well, that's pretty distinct. What's the third activity?
And then we move on to production and consumption, which throws up a much more interesting set of results. Because conversely, when you look at categories related to crafts, industries and agriculture, animal husbandry and food processing, the results didn't distinguish between the Wick and burh sites. The lack of variation shown by this correspondence analysis suggests that by and large, the occupants of both settlements were engaged in similar productive activities. What this analysis created was effectively a baseline of what mid to late Saxons were doing with their days. Once I'd identified this, that people were doing the same things in both places, I decided to review the specific details of all the sites. I needed to find the nuance, because in this case, correspondence analysis was something of a blunt tool. Interestingly, the archaeological evidence for productive activities indicates that even in its final phases, when it's supposedly entering a period of stagnation and economic decline, Londonwic contained active producers and consumers. Production was high and it was diversified. So 22 sites, which is 84% of those investigated, produced evidence for 2 or more productive activities. And the demand side of the market dynamic is reflected in the common occurrence of imported ceramics, vessel glass, and durable personal items like combs, brooches, beads.
And what did you make of that?
Even in these late phases, locals in Lundenwic had access to a wide range of locally, regionally, and continentally made products. And many of the sites provided evidence, not necessarily of elite status, but of a certain amount of disposable wealth. So the inhabitants of Lundenwic desired the finer things in life, and they worked hard to make sure they got them.
So how did that compare to the burh?
The evidence for production and consumption in Lundenwic is in marked contrast. There were fewer different activities identified, and there was significantly less evidence for each of these activities on a per-site basis. So only 5 sites, which is 30%, produced evidence for 2 or more such activities. They seem to be much less diversified. They would focus on producing one kind of activity rather than having multifarious households where people were doing all sorts of different activities. And the distributions of the other material culture in London also differed. No vessel glass, not common imported pottery. These items were either less available or they were less commonly used, or both. Overall, it would appear that people living in Londonburg before 950 were not only engaged in fewer productive activities than their counterparts, they were also consumers of a narrower range and smaller quantities of products. Now, this isn't to say that we didn't find some interesting artefacts in Londonburg. There were some well-preserved imported luxury textiles in Milk Street. At Queenhithe, there's a cluster of early artefacts and coins. And all of these indicate that Scandinavian, continental, and non-local connections existed from the mid-8th century onwards. But the character of the town seems to be much less trade-orientated. Moneyers' dies were found in St. Paul's churchyard, and that suggests that coins were being minted in London in the 9th century before Alfred's supposed reoccupation. So probably have an economy that requires coin, you have an elite who can go and buy these things. So I'm not saying that Londonburg was a backwater, but it certainly didn't have the same amount of regional commerce and production and consumption as Lundenwic. One particularly interesting nugget thrown up by my research, which I don't touch upon in the paper, relates to the archaeological representation of food production as evidenced by quernstones. Now, I took quernstones as being an indicator of domestic production of flour. Now, while quern fragments were excavated at 20 sites in Lundenwic, they were only found at one Londonburg location. It's possible that querns had become more valuable or difficult to obtain by the mid to late 9th century, and perhaps they were being curated. Perhaps watermills were being constructed. But it was interesting to see that one part of day-to-day life that would seem so very fundamental, the domestic grinding of grains, was very differently represented archaeologically between the two settlements.
So are you telling me that the past was messy, or is there a narrative to tell here?
I think all these things are messy, aren't they? There's no clear interpretations. I do have some thoughts on that. I think, first of all, my work confirms current models of a disconnect in the archaeology of 9th century London. There is no overlap between the occupation of Lundenwic and Londonburg. So we have some form of temporal or population hiatus between the occupation of the two settlements. And this corresponds with the idea of a protracted, gradual and indirect shift of activity taking place over the course of the 9th century. There's no uniform terminus ante quem for occupation at sites in Lundenwic. So their occupation may have ceased at any point or points in the first half of the 9th century. And the reasons for and timing of the abandonment of Wick sites and the reoccupation of sites in Londonburg could well have differed on a case-by-case basis. And it's also conceivable that groups from a wider area with different traditions and affiliations might have repopulated the intramural area in the decades following 950. So the different patterns and intensities of archaeological activity may reflect a dispersed and not a fully urban pattern of differentially functioning locations and populations within this wider but still interconnected landscape. So if you look at it from the perspective of a minimalist view of late Saxon urbanism, the research reflects a faltering development and perhaps a distinct contraction in urban growth in 9th century London, and it absolutely attests the reality of non-linear urban development in the late Saxon period.
Okay, so why did the population move east?
As to why the shift took place, I need to return to the question of the significance of the move between Lundenwic and Londonburh for individual Londoners. Archaeology that represents mundane activities, domestic life, and small-scale economic production, consumption, and interaction. The move between the Wick and Burh could be interpreted as just as likely to have resulted from numerous individual or collective decisions during decades of insecurity as from any authoritarian decree by someone like Alfred. So in my view, the occupants of 9th century Lundenwic and Londonburh should be granted capacity and agency of their own, and we should be mindful of potential pluralities of individual motivation. The individuals, their networks, their affiliations, the objects, structures, and activities habitual to and commonplace in their communities, along with the external forces to which they were all subject, they're interrelated agents that directly affect each other. And perhaps this complex interplay of individual, community, settlement, and larger and smaller scale events gives wider context to the abandonment of Lundenwic and the development of Londonburh. Now, that's not a neat narrative, doesn't give us a story. So we can finish off with a little bit of a story. Perhaps I can pull some things out of the historical sources and relate them to the archaeology. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 842 describes great slaughter in London. We don't talk about this very much, and we're often surprised that there is not more mention of a massive slaughter in the Covent Garden area. But as one trigger event, this would appear to correlate with the chronology for the abandonment of Lundenwic. It took place a full 40 years prior to Alfred's supposed reoccupation, but an ad hoc relocation of the survivors of that event to the safer yet familiar walled city could have paved the way for the gradual redevelopment of the intramural area. There's archaeological materials at some Wick sites that could tentatively be linked to these threats, including defensive ditches and significant fire destruction layers, although fire was a constant risk in a primarily wooden settlement. And nor should we be too quick to ascribe the need for refuge to residents of Lundenwic only. It's possible that groups from a wider area might have sought protection or opportunity in this repopulated settlement. So if we allow the possibility that a gradual and ad hoc move of an ordinary population may have taken place during the second half of the century, we can also reassess two of Alfred's charters from the end of the century. Now, these granted strategically significant trading sites near Queenhithe to the archbishops of Worcester and Canterbury. You can imagine they're probably his richest cronies, and he's paying them back for some favours previously granted. Or perhaps he's buying his place in heaven. That was a common theme among Saxon rulers. And the charters refer to streets and market tolls, the trading shore and mooring rights. And while these grants are being interpreted by some historians as the realisation of Alfred's formal plan of development, it's also possible that they're evidence of an attempt by the elite to profit from pre-existing and lucrative trading sites. But what it does illustrate is the continuance of trade at a time of renewed Viking incursions and the ability, again, of the elite to take advantage of profitable cash flows. So rather than inferring that the reoccupation of Londonburh was inspired by a unified plan of redevelopment, an alternative explanation for Alfred's continued interest in London in the 880s could be a pragmatic, if mercenary, desire to take advantage of the situation on the ground in a strategic location. Under this interpretation, the actions of the leaders represent elite recognition that Lundenwic's significance had faded and that the population and commercial heart of the region were now refocused within the intramural area. So on this basis, the actions of the ruling class become consequent to and contingent upon evolving economic centres and independent population shifts of individuals and local groups.
How are you going to develop this work further?
Okay, so my work is continuing, and I'm looking into how and why London developed its particular significance and authority. It's really taking the same roots and expanding upon them more broadly. I'm looking at when its development diverged from that of other medieval towns, and I'm exploring whether the archaeologically attested occupation identities can help identify the origins of this character and status, and looking as well at broader issues of the trajectories of urban growth. And I do this by focusing on the archaeological representation of mundane lived experiences in Middle and Late Saxon London, as in this paper, but also in Westminster and Southwark. I'm very interested in individuals, what ordinary people, whether their lives, their activities had an impact upon urban development, about community development, whether they are as important players really from an archaeological and historical perspective as the elites, the ones who are more generally written about.
And how do you see the future of research on Saxon London?
The question of the nature and extent of 9th century Saxon occupation in London is so broad. There's a possibility for full exploration of the many relevant toponymic, numismatic, and ecclesiastical sources, particularly the latter. And then it could be broadened out to include data from post-2007 excavations, which have been conducted with the most up-to-date standards and technologies. So they should provide a wealth of data that may completely disprove everything I've talked about today, or more hopefully would confirm it. More widely speaking, statistical techniques such as correspondence analysis are becoming more and more used, and it's known that they're of little interpretive use in the absence of complete understanding of the details and context of the underlying archaeological data. Hopefully, my work demonstrates that synthesizing case studies with a granular multivariate method demonstrates the value of pursuing multiple forms of analysis, where the results of each method can be seen as complementing and auditing the conclusions reached by the others.
I'm looking forward to it. Victoria Ziegler, thank you very much for talking to me today. We were talking there in some detail about multiple forms of data analysis applied to a particular case study, and I want to develop that thought further now. My next guest is Professor Helena Hamerow of Oxford University and the FeedSax project. Together with colleagues, Helena published a paper in the European Journal of Archaeology on an integrated bioarchaeological approach to the medieval agricultural revolution and its context relating to those fortified Saxon towns. So welcome, Helena. Can we start by talking about the research project and the background to this research?
The work was done as part of a European Research Council funded project, which is called Feeding Anglo-Saxon England, by a fairly large all-star cast of postdoctoral researchers and senior colleagues based at the universities of Oxford and Leicester. I should say that first of all. Feeding Anglo-Saxon England, which we call FeedSax for short, looks at the so-called medieval agricultural revolution. That is itself a slightly controversial label, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but it refers to some major changes in farming that took place across much of Europe between around 800 and 1200 that had a really huge impact on society and on the European economy. And these new ways of farming that developed in that period enabled, above all, a vast expansion in cereal production. And that enabled, for the first time since the Roman period, regular large cereal surpluses to be produced. And the impact of that was huge. So it fueled, first of all, a steep population growth. So if we're just talking about England, around the time of Domesday Book in 1086, we reckon the population of England was less than 2 million. By about 200 years later, so shortly before 1300, we reckon it was nearly 5 million. So a really steep demographic growth. That growth, in turn, of course, stimulated the growth of towns, the expansion of markets, and so on. So that's the first big important concept to get our heads around in relation to the medieval agricultural revolution. But then secondly, just like in the Neolithic, there was a link between cereal surpluses and wealth inequalities. So in the medieval period, those cereal surpluses enabled the rise of lordship. So landowners were able to extract surpluses in the form of rent from peasants who actually worked the land. So cereal farming, in this period really underlies the rise of the first landed aristocracy who were able to amass considerable amounts of wealth from the labor of others. Now, a lot of what we know about, or think we know about the medieval agricultural revolution does come from written sources. And for England, most of those sources date to what is for me quite a late period, so the 12th and 13th centuries. The Frankish world did produce somewhat earlier sources, 8th, 9th century sources, and those sources indicate that this great increase in cereal production was largely due to three key innovations. First of all, systematic crop rotation, which meant that a larger proportion of arable could be cultivated at any one time. Second was the use of the heavy moldboard plow, which turned the furrows over and allowed farmers to cultivate heavier, more fertile soils and also to plow more in a single day. And then thirdly, an extensive or low input farming regime in which the fertility of the fields wasn't maintained by intensive manuring or intensive tillage, or indeed very long fallow periods where you just leave the fields to recover for 10 years or whatever, but rather by short fallow periods during which sheep would be allowed to graze on the stubble and the weeds in the fallow fields. So we refer to that as extensification. as opposed to intensification. So you expand the area of land under the plow by investing less manure and labor per land unit. The debate, or the big problem about this, is that nobody can really agree about when and how this all happened. In England, was it mostly a post-Norman conquest phenomenon, or was it already well underway by the time of the conquest? Was the serialization of the landscape, was that a kind of gradual piecemeal thing that happened over several centuries, or was there a kind of big bang, which is of course what the concept of an agricultural revolution sort of implies? Was there a moment when all three innovations came together? So there's been quite a fierce debate going on about that for well over a century now. And the reason nobody has really been able to agree largely is that the evidence that we have, it's mostly quite late. So like I mentioned, much of it's 12th, 13th century, and it's all really indirect. Either it's coming from later maps and written documents that were probably written or potentially quite a long time after these innovations came into effect, from things like place names, manuring scatters, and so on. So in a way, what inspired the project was the realization that what we needed was new data. And that is really the aim of FEATSAX, is to generate new direct evidence for the conditions in which medieval crops were grown by actually analyzing scientifically the remains of medieval crops, medieval weeds, and livestock. And by doing that, we hope to advance this debate.
It's certainly a wide-ranging and integrated approach. What methods are you using?
We combined a range of analytical techniques to look at a range of archaeological evidence. So first of all, we used, I think for the first time for a historic period, crop stable isotope analysis. We undertook a kind of biochemical analysis of grains, of cereal grains from excavated sites to tell us several things. First of all, whether or not those crops had been manured, how heavily manured, whether that changed over time. It can give you an indication of whether several different cereals would have been grown in the same fields in rotation. So were they growing, wheat and barley and rye in rotation, the same conditions, or were they grown in different conditions? It can also tell you whether those crops were grown in relatively lighter, drier soils, or whether at some point they expanded onto heavier, wetter soils. So we're looking at carbon and nitrogen values. Then we looked at not only the cereal grains, but we also looked at the arable weed seeds preserved by accidental charring. The weed seeds would have been harvested together with the cereals and then preserved along with them. And weeds also, of course, reflect growing conditions. So the type of weeds that grew will have varied, again, along with how heavily manured the fields were, sowing times, that kind of thing. So those two quite novel techniques were applied to the archaeobotanical material, but we also used more kind of standard quantitative techniques looking at crop preferences, crop diversification over time, regional change. But we also looked at pollen data. So we've got data from quite a large number of published and unpublished cores, and we've even taken a few new cores ourselves. And that has been to look at, to some extent, how open the landscape was, although previous work has shown that by the time of the early medieval period, the landscape, certainly of the British lowlands, was by and large open. But what we didn't know, and what we really need to understand, is to what extent in this period arable expanded at the expense of pasture. So we think from written sources that pasture may have been really in quite short supply by the conquest period, but there's really, again, no direct evidence for that. That's kind of inference. And then where possible, we've also brought in animal bone evidence. And again, using fairly novel methods to look at the question of traction. How heavily were cattle now being used for traction as opposed to either meat or other secondary products? And to do that, one of the postdocs has recorded certain types of pathologies in cattle foot bones that they tend to develop if they're, particularly if they're pulling a very heavy plow and under a lot of stress, because obviously cattle are not designed to pull a plow. And if they're spending a lot of their lives doing that, then they will develop certain sorts of pathologies. So she's been recording that and also been recording overall the change in proportion of sheep to cattle, because this also could provide us with a kind of proxy for the expansion of arable. So we're using all these different types of organic materials, and that has been great in many respects, but one obvious problem is differential preservation. So we've not been able to use all these techniques to every single site. Different soil conditions preserve animal bones from the types of soil conditions that you might need to preserve pollen. So it's not perfect. But of course, the great thing is that you can date this sort of material using radiocarbon dating, and we've got a very robust chronological framework from over 200 dates now that the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit has provided us with.
And you needed a really good case study to be so comprehensive.
Yeah, the paper that we published focused on one particular site that happens to have really great data, and that's the town of Stafford in England. Stafford was, we know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it was fortified against the Vikings by a woman called Athelflaed, who was the daughter of Alfred the Great, and she evidently fortified it in the year 913. Stafford has seen a number of really fairly large scale and very well recorded excavations over the years and has produced some really well preserved, particularly archaeobotanical remains, but also pollen cores from just within the medieval town or just adjacent to the medieval town itself. And also, unusually, very good quality data from across several centuries. So really from the kind of late 9th century right up to the 13th century, we've got well-preserved material. So that was really exceptional. So that's why we focused on Stafford as a kind of worked example where we could bring together all these analytical techniques to bear and hopefully generate some good new results.
So in interpreting all this new information, what can you say now about the agricultural environment?
So I'm going to start with the pollen data. Perhaps one of the most striking things that the pollen data showed us is that the landscape around Stafford was already heavily arable by the 8th and 9th centuries. And indeed that around the 8th and 9th centuries, we see a wider range of crops and associated weeds coming in. So that already suggested that maybe the reason Stafford was fortified in 913 because it was already in a very productive area with cereal surpluses being generated and so on. So that was new and a little unexpected because the excavations hadn't really produced any evidence of occupation from such an early date. Then we looked, of course, at the weed data to look at this question of extensification, because the more extensive cereal farming is, the implication is the larger scale it was. So intensive tends to be smaller scale, extensive tends to be larger scale. And what the weeds showed quite clearly was that in the earlier period, 9th to mid-10th century, there was quite a spectrum of farming practices. So some relatively small scale intensive farming ranging up to really pretty low input, pretty extensive farming. But in the later 10th century, we see a shift. And from that point onwards, farming is uniformly highly extensive, really low input, large scale farming. And one possible implication of that is that this is when open field farming is introduced. And that's impossible for us to demonstrate one way or another, but open field farming is a really highly extensive, low input way of farming. So something definitely happens in the later 10th century. We then looked at the weeds in another way. We used correspondence analysis to see if we could identify seasonal sowing patterns and if there was an association between spring or autumn germinating weeds and particular cereals. And that did indeed tease out some consistent associations. So it looks as though wheat and rye were consistently being sown in the autumn to produce a kind of winter growing crop, whereas barley was being sown in the spring. And that brought us on to the question of crop rotation. Were they, systematically growing different crops in the same field in rotation? And the crop stable isotope analysis really showed two things. First of all, it did show that wheat, oats, and rye were almost certainly being grown in rotation from at least the middle of the 10th century. I mean, maybe they were doing it earlier, but we didn't have any earlier data. But interestingly, barley was different. Barley could not possibly have been grown in rotation with the other three because it showed quite different soil conditions. So that was a little unexpected and interesting. And this crop stable isotope analysis also showed us that in the 11th century, around the middle of the 11th century, farmers seem to have expanded onto heavier, wetter soil, so more fertile soils. So we saw an enrichment of the N values, of the nitrogen values. And you might normally think, well, maybe that just means they were manuring their fields more, because that's one possible interpretation of an enrichment of soil N values. But when we looked at the weeds made it clear that it was still a very low input, low manuring system. They weren't manuring. The higher end values must be due to an expansion onto more enriched soils, heavier, more enriched soils. So those were the results and the interpretations that flowed from them. So we were able to see clear changes taking place there well before the Norman conquest. And indeed that arguably the serialization or the heavy shift to arable was already there before Athelflaed ever turned up at Stafford and fortified the town. Presumably it was chosen by her because it was already a very productive place where, cereal farming was happening on a large scale, surpluses were being generated, and it had to be protected for that reason. So Stafford turned out to be a really, really good case study.
Now the project is ongoing, so what are the wider ambitions?
Well, I think having shown with Stafford that the approach can work and that can give us good results, we've then, in the last year or so, been rolling it out and applying it to around 10 other case study sites in England. We've got a national database, but we're looking in detail at about 10 sites. But we've also been had a sort of little side project looking at medieval cereal farming in the Rhineland. It's not been published yet, but that's the next big paper, I think, to come out. The reason we chose the Rhineland is twofold. Historically, it's very interesting. It's part of Charlemagne's heartland, so it's where we think the earliest stages of the agricultural revolution, so-called, may have taken place. But also it's a region, so we're talking about the region around Cologne, around Bonn. It's a region that has seen a lot of really large-scale coal mining over many decades, with a lot of rescue excavation in advance of that. So they've got a huge archaeobotanical assemblage that takes us all the way from the Neolithic right up to the Central Middle Ages. So the Rhineland material enabled us to situate early medieval farming within this much longer, the longue durée, and to test certain theories. And one of the theories was what happened after the Roman period. So historians used to think that after the departure of the Roman army and the Roman system of taxation and so on, that farming must have kind of gone back to the Stone Age. In the 1940s and 50s, they literally thought that. They thought medieval peasants basically farmed more or less as they had done in prehistory. And our results showed very clearly that that was not the case. There was possibly a bit of a stalling episode or a kind of plateauing or slight reversion in the 7th and 8th centuries. But that story of extensification of farming becoming ever more large scale and low input is one that just kind of marches on through the Roman and medieval periods. And we also identified, very interestingly, systematic crop rotation, taking place in peasant farmsteads, really early date, 7th, 8th century, long before there would have been lords or monastic landlords getting involved. So we have evidence of some bottom-up innovation going on there. So that's what we're working on at the moment, or publishing at the moment. But we're also moving on to look at comparing the medieval weed data with some modern proxies. So we undertook some botanical surveys at an organic cereal farm at Highgrove in Gloucestershire, farm owned by Prince Charles, famous for producing organic flowers and so on, and also at a place called Laxton in Nottinghamshire, which sometimes calls itself England's last open field village. They still farm in ways that are not wholly dissimilar to what was done in the Middle Ages. So we're working through that data in the hope that that's going to help us really refine our interpretations.
Yeah, I think the contribution to archaeology is much wider than just the early medieval period. So how do you see this methodology developing in the future?
I think what FeedSax shows is that scientific approaches or scientific analyses that were developed to investigate the origins of farming in the Neolithic can also be applied to historic periods to produce new data. I mean, normally, prehistorians and medievalists don't work together very often, but this was a really valuable way of bringing a set of questions about the Middle Ages together with a set of analytical techniques that were designed to address prehistoric questions. And I think it also shows how combining a range of different analytical approaches, the weed data, the crop stable isotope analysis, the pollen, the animal bones, if you bring these things together and the specialists needed to do it together, that can be a really powerful tool for reconstructing past farming regimes, and much more powerful than just looking at one or two of these things in isolation, which is what we tend to do. And I guess finally, I hope it shows how archaeology can really bring new data and new perspectives to bear, even on some really old debates, and generate that new data where it's needed.
Professor Helena Hamerow, thank you very much for joining me today. And thanks again to Victoria Ziegler. And I hope you'll join me next time on Foreign Countries.